Good morning, friends. Welcome. This is CEC Gurukul live lecture series, and under this series, we've been covering world literature as a kind of entity that connects with all of us together. And in this series, we have already covered most of the literatures which were main in our opinion, and about which talks were held. And this being the last month of the series, we at the end of it, in the last week, let's say, we are starting now summing it up. And today is the first part of the summing up that is being done by Dr. Payal Nagpal, our expert. I'll introduce her a bit later, but before that, let me tell you that we have from 10:40 onwards time for discussion with the viewers. So you can raise questions, you can in fact share your observations if you like, you can differ with us, you can ask for questions that might be haunting you. All these things can be done in the last 20 minutes of the discussion that we have. And for this we have a toll-free number. The toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number for asking questions and taking part in the discussion towards the end of the lecture, that is from 10:40 onwards, is 1-800-110-430. And as I already told you, Dr. Payal Nagpal is the expert today to sum it up from her point of view. She was a major part of the discussion that we held. And Dr. Payal Nagpal, as you all know from the previous lectures, is a teacher of English in the Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. And she's a well-known academic. She has published books, articles, attended conferences, chaired sessions. And today she'll be doing the summing up, as I say. So I first welcome Dr. Payal Nagpal. Welcome to the discussion. And let me just ask one or two questions from you. And the question, for instance, is that we call it world literature. Now, because we are summing it up, so I would like to go back to all those points that you made. And I believe that there is something that is outside the purview of world literature, and we have not been discussing it earlier. For instance, literatures are country-specific. Indian literature, European literature, Russian literature, English literature. So what is so special about world literature as such, which is not country-specific? This is a question that I've been wondering about myself. And I thought that you could, after giving those lectures, you could then tell us as to what is distinct about world literature that we call it.
I think you've raised a very, very important point here, Professor Prakash, because this is also going to help us, really speaking, string together a lot of the points and issues that we have been discussing as part of this 20th Century World Literature series. And I think here we also need to bring in the whole point about borders. The idea that when we talk about borders, do we look at borders as a constructive, or do we look at borderless, merging of countries?
What is your stand?
I think we need to look at the viability of both points. So, for instance, when we talk about or let's say Australian literature, literature from Japan, literature from China, literature from Iran. So we're looking at different belts. And in that case, I think it would be better to problematize literature from those countries, in terms of borders, in the sense that the country of origin, that this is where the literature has originated.
Generally speaking, are borders essential in today's world?
I think when we look at it from the perspective of humanity, the idea is that humanity should flow, and it should flow in a way that borders should not be important. But at the same time, we also live in a world that's hugely divided. And to then talk about borderless contexts, that should be the ideal. But till we reach that ideal, I think to assert oneself in terms of those borders also becomes very, very significant.
Would you call borders a kind of identity of the country?
Yes, so when we look at it, for instance, in terms of literature, so the whole idea about borders and literature originating in that particular country, so that is one part of it. So we look at the literatures belonging to that particular country. And this is very, very significant, because when we move beyond that, for instance, when we look at world literature, so for instance, if we are talking about the assertion of borders, so from that point, how do we translate that into world literature? That should in a sense be the next question. So when we move to the idea of world literature, it's important that we also look at not simply literature that belongs to a kind of borderless zone, but how despite those borders, literatures interact with each other. And literature of one country takes on, learns, gives back to literature, let's say, of a neighboring country.
Oh, that's the important point you say, that when you talk from India, let you talk from another country, then you are talking about that country. But at the same time, you also keep in mind humanism.
Yes.
You also keep in mind the human identity, which is common to all of us. So literature, has this double role to play. It straddles, for instance,
Yes.
this and that.
This and that.
So there is humanity, which is one, and there are people, who are divided along borders, and they understand the significance of the borders. At the same time, they know that someday or the other, these borders will change, and it will be a whole world new. This is what you say?
Yes, this is what I'm saying, because when we look at it's important to keep those borders in mind, to understand that these are the nuances of literature that emerges, let's say, for instance, what happened in Iran, or let's say what happened in China, and that's how that the literature from that country emerges. Yet at the same time, this literature would have been affected at some stage, let's say, by literature from, let's say, European countries, because people traveled there and there was this interaction. So world literature actually becomes a very interesting term, not simply a blanket term to talk about literature from various countries, but to look at the kind of continuum that is formed. And this continuum becomes very, very significant, I think, in the 20th century. So there particularly how through travel, through interaction, and through increased mobility, this kind of an literary interaction that emerges and picks space in the 20th century becomes a very significant point.
And another significant point, that's not about borders, that's about language. Not about country, but about language. A country may have one language, maybe 3 or 4 countries have one language. In the other case, a country has 10 languages, 20 languages, 30 languages. So would literature be language specific within the border, and then also it can connect with languages elsewhere and literature? How does one understand this? I find it a bit problematic, but maybe you can help.
I think the way I would look at it is to look at it not only in terms of literature being language specific, but also in a sense, culture specific, where culture would actually include everything, not simply the language, but let's say the region. Let's say it is a region that's a far-flung area. It's doesn't have that kind of accessibility. So what would be the literature that emerges from a place like this? So I think in that sense, culture is a composite that takes into consideration these different factors. I think we would have to look at literature from that perspective.
So culture articulating itself through language, that language connecting with another language, and through the language, cultures are connecting with another. So it's that kind of a paradoxical, dialectical situation.
Yes, I think it's that kind of a dialectical situation that
where languages are not enemies of each other. Maybe sometimes borders are, but not languages. Maybe the culture that we talk of, that unites all the time. Literature unites, language unites, culture unites. And if borders are separate, that's a challenge that humanity can face at different levels.
In fact, that idea of separation itself is contested through literature. It challenges that idea of the border, as something that separates. I think there's a difference between asserting identity, for instance, and talking about separating one area from the other. So literature in that sense poses a challenge to it, and yet at the same time makes use of it by asserting identity.
In a way, you are foregrounding, pedestalizing literature with reference to borders, politics, economics. Are you doing that?
I don't want to place it there on a pedestal, because literature should always be accessible. Literature should always be accessible to people. People should always be in that process of creating ideas, and they should have access to literature in that sense and should be able to then contribute to it. So, but literature is a key to kind of understanding a lot of issues that are there around us. So that becomes a very, very important point, and placed within the context again of this idea of world literature. I think literature becomes, I think if we look at it, these two terms, world and literature, the whole idea, whether we look at it in terms of the globe, we look at it in terms of different borders, we look at the multiplicity of languages, of cultures. So all that is the point of entry towards all this, and an understanding of all this is through literature.
That's a very valid point, and a point that should enthuse writers, to think along idealistic lines, as you say, because they should create ideals, they should create dreams for humanity to pursue, so that later on, when the dreams are fulfilled, human beings get together better. This is what you're saying.
Yes.
And there is a lot of appeal in that. With respect to it, then you did certain lectures, from each region in the world. So tell us about which particular region you found culturally, literarily more enriching than another, if that happened.
It's very difficult to actually say that one region would be more culturally rich than the other. I think all of them. I think at least for me, this entire series was extremely educative, and it really made me ask questions about the manner in which and the context from which that literature emerged. And I think the beauty of it lies in the fact that the conditions in which literature emerges in each country is very, very different.
For instance, there is a problem. You see, like you, I also have been associated with English literature. So I always look at the world from that angle. And English literature is a crystallization, let's say, of Renaissance values, humanism and all that. But when we were doing the lectures, when you were, for instance, speaking about certain authors, then I felt, that those authors perhaps were still more significant than some of the authors in England.
Yes.
And we had not known about this. So the 20th century writing gives us an opportunity to look critically at what we have been doing in our own life for the last so many years. And we have a lot to learn from those other languages which are not a part of our study.
Which is totally true, and that's why I said that it's very difficult to kind of talk about any one kind of literature as being culturally rich as compared to the other. But the whole series has been extremely educative precisely because of this, because we've had a very, very a Eurocentric sort of approach, thinking that this is what literature is and this is how it's created. And it's only when one travels, through literature into different zones and different countries, different areas, that one realizes that literature has been in the making there too. And the way it has emerged. I mean, for instance, if we just take a look at one of the poets that we did from Africa, I thought it would be a good idea to actually, go back and try and string together the writers that we had picked up in this series. So, for instance, Frank Chipasula's writing, where, he two things that I think are very, very significant as part of this world literature series. One is this whole idea of making the nation. Now, here too, I think we need to look at it from the point of view of the question that has just been raised about borders and about culture, language, literature. So when we talk about the making of the nation, one of the things that came to my mind about this was that on the one hand, literature engages with this idea of the making of the nation, but it's not restricted to one country, which means that this is a kind of trend that is there in the 20th century especially, I think particularly post 1945. And across the world, different countries are making use of genres, especially poetry, I think, not that I want to privilege it over fiction or drama, but the sheer accessibility, I think, of poetry and the fact that its readability. So that makes for this whole idea of the nation that is under construction, and it's interesting to note a shift. I think in almost most of the countries actually that we've discussed here, and most of the writers from those countries that we've discussed here. So there is a phase in which there is the ideal of the nation about, when they are fighting for freedom, for instance. And once that freedom has been achieved, so the tone of poetry changes once again. And the idea is that the ideal that had been created has in a sense been achieved, has been fulfilled.
You were giving an example. Please do that.
Yes.
Because that will turn it into a kind of concrete thing.
Yes. So when we look at it from this idea of the construction of the nation and creating that ideal and struggling for it. So for instance, I'd like to bring in Frank Chipasula here. So these lines, they ran out of handcuffs, but with apologies for the inconvenience, they carefully wrapped barbed wire round the wrists of the political prisoners, who, as if in a ritual, stretched their arms out to the young masters.
These are good lines.
Yes, and here they are struggling. So at the same time there is a shift, because once this freedom has been achieved, so what does the nation aspire to be now, and what are the ideas that should now govern the country? And these kind of shifts, I think we could actually locate in almost all the writers that we discussed as part of the World Literature series. So where this idea of framing would be peculiar to that particular country, but this is a concern that we can see in the series altogether.
These lines are so powerful, as if the person were looking at the past and then critically became aware of it, and then now starts thinking of new challenges.
Yes.
That there is a new phase in which one has to work with different parameters.
With different parameters.
So could you read these lines again?
Yes,
for the benefit of the viewers who might have.
So this is Frank Chipasula. They ran out of handcuffs, but with apologies for the inconvenience, they carefully wrapped barbed wire round the wrists of the political prisoners, who, as if in a ritual, stretched their arms out to the young masters.
See the range, the scope here. Yes.
Yeah. So again, in a lot of other, for instance, we discussed the Mexican poet Octavio Paz's poem, "The Sunstone," which is a very long one, and makes use of myth, legend, forms of social coexistence, and what does it mean to Paz to be a writer? So he says being a Mexican writer means listening to the voice of that presence. So these ideas, as we can see, this whole idea of the present, the notion of creation, writers are conscious of it. So if we were to, through this process of summing up, look at some of the features, the aspects of the world, of the idea of world literature, I think one would certainly be this idea of the construction of the nation. The other would be this notion of being the voice of the present. So, what is it? How are we capturing that moment? I think a lot of these writers are concerned with that. So
you have, given these examples, and these examples are from outside Europe.
Yes.
You've given the example from Africa, and you also use the term Eurocentric. So before I frame this question, what is exactly Eurocentric, and what are the flaws that are there in it, if at all there are flaws?
Actually, more than flaws, I wouldn't want to look at them as flaws. However, in the 20th century, of course, I think this whole idea of Eurocentrism is credited with a certain kind of writing, and the whole modernist trend, particularly, that really takes the imagination of the writers, the poets, and so on. However, modernism is used in a way that somehow, at least to my mind, does not allow the writers to kind of look at things in a constructive manner. So
suppose I say, now that you say this, that modernism is a concept that emerged in Europe, and then it covered the entire world. So economically speaking, Europe was the colonizer, and the rest of the world was colonized. So if something emerged in Europe, as you say, modernism, then this modernism would be a kind of item that the whole world is supposed to follow.
Yes. So at the level of aesthetics, so when we talk about something that's Eurocentric, as I said, more than the flaws, I think one needs to look at the fact that maybe the Eurocentric trend was more towards focusing on aesthetics to talk about the kind of problems that people were facing there, and the general mood of, you know, the two world wars and so on. So a kind of the mood was, in a sense, you know, expressing the anxiety, the angst, a kind of desolation that existed for the individual. However, the same modernist trend, when it is used by writers from other countries, they do not use it necessarily in this way of kind of expressing a kind of desolate mood, but they use it in a more constructive manner. So
this is very interesting.
Yes.
That same modernism, which is so depressing and which is so disillusioning
Yes.
in Europe, when it is being used by countries outside Europe, then its very structure changes.
Yes, its very structure changes. And I mean, these writers might really speaking, so for instance, if we look at Ahmad Shamlou from Iran, who says, in this dead end, they smell your mouth to find out if you have told someone, I love you. They smell your heart. Such a strange time it is, my dear, and they punish love at thoroughfares by flogging. We must hide our love in dark closets. So a certain kind of technique, though of course modernist technique also, modernist writing and technique, you know, goes, tries to increase the level of complexity, but it's been used in different ways by writers outside. So the Eurocentric mode, in a sense, that emerges in the 20th century, where it kind of, you know, shows the path ahead, and writers from different countries, through this interaction with the European countries, make use of the aesthetic trends, but they use it in their own context.
This division is very valuable. You are dividing literature into an aesthetic and an idea. So as an idea, this might be imprisoning, but as an aesthetic, you know, when you take it as an aesthetic,
Yes.
then, you know, within that aesthetic, you can talk of your own experiences, as happened in the case of these writers. That, you know, modernism, as you pointed out, was that way a bit cynical, if not cynical, at least not appreciative of the emotion of love. But when these, in your quoted line, the same love then becomes an instrument of understanding the world.
Yes.
So that's how an aesthetic that way becomes a liberating sort of force.
I think the classic example here, you know, from within that tradition itself to kind of contest this, you know, very pessimistic mood, if one may say so, is Bertolt Brecht. And Brecht, of course, you know, while making use of the whole montage structure and so on, but is able to give a huge sense of direction, actually. And in fact does not take that away. So immense, you know, very, very positive attitude is what Brecht really speaking kind of, you know, instills in people through the plays. Not that they are didactic in that sense, but raises questions, makes people think, does not put them in that kind of, you know, very, very depressing, desolate sort of a mood.
Like, you know, you talked of love in this case, and there is that famous poem by Eliot, Love Song. It's not about love song, it's about something else.
Yes.
But then the same love in the hands of a poet from a non-European country and ethos will express things differently.
Absolutely. So, which is why this idea of, you know, the whole Eurocentric tradition that we talk about, so one tends to privilege that, actually. I don't think there is, if we use the term of a problem or a flaw, it's not so much a flaw within, because that's also the response, let's say, for instance, of those writers to their context. But, sometimes, at least I wonder, because those are also writers who belong to the land of the colonizer. So it's not, you know, writers are sensitive people. So when they kind of consider themselves to be a part of a construct that is, in a sense, exploitative, I think that needs to be kind of also looked at when we examine the work of writers from that particular context. But because of this whole equation of colonization, this privileging of the Eurocentric tradition only, and privileging in the sense of interpreting it in only one manner, without really expanding it to see what the non-European countries have really done with that aesthetic, so to say. I think that is a very important, that's what's lacking.
And you rightly gave the example of Bertolt Brecht. This person belongs to the main European country, Germany, and he's, you know, borrowing myths and legends from the world outside. And then, you know, he puts very sharp questions in front of their own culture. So in fact, he's a part of the third world. He's a part of the world outside Europe, even though he otherwise is European.
Yes.
So that kind of a thing can be broken. The European hold on the imagination of the world can be broken by a person who is critical of oneself and who is raising questions.
Totally agree with that, because we have a tendency of looking at modernism and the Eurocentric tradition only in a particular manner, which is through, let's say, T.S. Eliot's love song and so on. But there is also a Bertolt Brecht that who's writing around the same time, a little later. So and that kind of writing is very, very different. So
he takes a Chinese tale and turns it into a play.
His use of the parable form. So that in a sense should give us an inkling into the idea that we do not look at a tradition only from one point of view, but it's important to look at that kind of aesthetics from the point of view of a lot of other writers from other countries. That would actually make it more meaningful, because a lot of these writers, as part of this world literature series that we studied, a lot of these writers were influenced by the European writers, but they were able to transform that aesthetic itself through their idea, as you put it. So the whole kind of relationship between the idea and the aesthetic acquires new meaning when we look at it from the point of view of literature. So also when we look at these, the trends, the aesthetics, the techniques that are used, the ideas that are put forth. So the literary continuum that is created through this idea of world literature also transforms the aesthetics and the way they originate in a particular country. So,
I think this idea has been very well elucidated by you, and now I shift to the other question that you mentioned in your discussion, and you mentioned a very important date. That date was post 1945.
Yes.
So what exactly does this this particular phase, 1945, signify?
I think post 1945, because a lot of countries actually, gain independence, after, be it in 1947, 1948, 1949. A lot of countries gain independence around this time. So it's significant because this whole idea of what is the kind of literature that is now needed? What is the role of literature? So there is a certain role that literature performs in the pre-1945 period. Within this context of world literature, where there is a colonizer, there are countries that function as a colonizer. Within those countries, there are writers who oppose that tradition, and then there are writers from the countries that have been colonized and they oppose that tradition. So, and once the countries have gained independence, now what is the kind of writing that is expected, and what should the role of the writer be? I think one of the important things that this world literature series has done is it has raised this very, very important question about the role of the writer in this new world, where they are independent, they are free thinking, they can come up with their own views, they can write freely, about a literature that they want to write, they want to create. So, and the kind of culture that they are talking about, in a sense, is totally in tandem with the kind of views that they are really putting forth in their works.
What exactly is the role of the writer in the post 1945 era? Today, that is?
I think in the post 1945 era, one of the important challenges I think that lies ahead is the ideal that was created to gain freedom, to create the idea of the nation. Now that nation building has to be done, and it is important
with a sense
for
of
the
responsibility.
Writer. There should be a sense of responsibility.
There should be an effort to create agreement over basic issues.
Yes, and also to I think one thing that is central is this idea of equality. So the idea of equality that writers used, for instance, to totally do away with that equation of a colonizer and a colonized, that now had to be translated in a different context, which is within the country itself. So if there are disparities, if there are
within
kind of hierarchies,
within one's own country,
within one's own country. So now this idea of equality had to be applied there. And here I'd like to bring in a second point. So one is this idea about freedom and then nation building, and the other is approaching it from the point of view of gender. I think if we look at a lot of the women writers, particularly that we have covered as part of this world literature series, so in the modern 20th century construct, I think they have all, in a sense, critiqued, very, very sharply critiqued patriarchy and this kind of imbalance that is created, when gender equality does not prevail. So, for instance, just as I read Frank Chipasula, I'd like to also kind of bring in some lines from a poem called Wife of the Husband by Misere Githai Mugo. So, who writes, his snores protect the sleeping hut, and a little later, his snores welcome her to bed, 4 hours to sunrise. His snores rouse her from bed, 6 sharp. Arise, O wife of the husband. So, in Africa, this is what Mugo is writing, or for that matter, Gwendolyn Coney, who writes in the 1950s and is from Zambia, writes, like a worm, I writhe in your tight fist, as you try to smother my voice, and my mind with your brutal grip. For I will not let fear swallow my breath, my dreams, and my hopes. My hidden courage will saw off your fist. So the kind of courage,
equally violent.
Yes, the kind of courage, the kind of power that is shown is really, really remarkable. And of course, we have the famous Farrukhzad from Iran, who wrote this poem called "The Wedding Band," and in the modern day context, totally critiqued the institution of marriage and said that. When in the poem "The Wedding Band," Farrukhzad writes, the girl smiled and said, "What is the secret of this golden ring? The secret of this ring that so tightly embraces my finger. The secret of this band that sparkles and shines so." The man was startled and said, "It's the ring of good fortune, the ring of life." So a few stanzas later, the poem ends like this. The woman grew agitated and cried out, "Oh my, this ring that still sparkles and shines is the band of slavery and servitude." So I think with this, so on the one hand, we have the idea of the values of let's say, secularism, democracy, equality. These are the values that should prevail at all levels. And then this whole idea of the imbalance that is there as far as women are concerned, and how women from across countries, be it Africa, be it Iran, I think this was a very, very important trend that we marked through this world literature series, how women from different countries actually oppose this kind of imbalance that is created through patriarchal structures.
So would you say that this emphasis on the problems of women, the emphasis on the attitude that women should adopt to the world around them, they are a gift of, and they are a child of the post-1945 era?
Yes.
It couldn't happen at earlier. There was no time, and people were busy with fighting other forces.
Yes, though it did. It's not that it did not happen earlier. Of course, it did, but it's just that as a marked trend, we certainly see it post 1945, where women become more conscious and realize that if this is their country, it belongs as much to them as it does to.
In fact, the whole world belongs, the way it belongs to the men.
Yes.
It also belongs to the women.
It also belongs to the women.
And this kind of breeze, the kind of wind, that is created and in this era, this becomes a storm in the 1980s, 1990s.
Yes.
There's no other important trend in literature as feminism is. And it's an assertion of the woman, and it's an assertion also of the critique of patriarchy, which is male-centered in any case.
In any case. So, for instance, when we look at these writers, we also have, when we move eastwards, then we have a poet like Yoko Nagase, who writes what is called Song of a Woman, where, Nagase writes about, with no friends of your own, you are looking only at me, and you accuse me. You accuse me of being inconsiderate. And, she says that, Nagase finally says that, not enough proof of loving you. How impudent of me not to be able to forecast today's weather for you. You always tell me to do things I can't. And so she says that, I wish I would start learning magic and so on. So these are trends that, can be seen across different countries. So, and which also tells us that, there is this idea of a specific identity through literature, through language, through regions. And then there are concerns that at the level of the ideas are common to, let's say, writers from different countries. However, those problems acquire different forms, different manifestations in each country, in each region. It would be looked at very differently.
Because you have very extensively dealt with these issues in your lectures. So tell me, if a kind of equality is established in the world on the basis of doing away with patriarchy, at least at the ideal level. So what kind of relationship between a man and a woman in the 20th century, latter half of the 20th century, would be envisioned? The positive relationship that exists between two equals, the man and the woman. Would that be a different kind of relationship, qualitatively dealing with issues in a new manner? What is the shape that is going to come of man-woman relationship in the new world and in world literature?
I think the most constructive, the most viable relationship between a man and a woman should be that of an intellectual collaboration, of looking at each other as equals, a sharing of ideas, a talking through of things. I think that is the most constructive way of evolving, equality in a sense. Between men and women.
And that is exemplified by the quotation that you give from women's poetry.
Yes.
Because they are not saying that they want to subdue the opponent the way earlier was subjected to that. So it's a kind of emphasis on equality. And they'll create, as you say, that they'll work together, that they will address each other at the level of equals. And then, the working together will be in the direction of establishing and enjoying equality.
Enjoying equality. Also because women are, in a sense, at one half of the workforce, and they have to be recognized as that. So when we look at some of the concerns that are expressed by these women, they identify those structures that are oppressive. And I think almost all of them identify marriage as an extremely oppressive institution, and they see that it is something that totally takes away that sense of equality from them. So, which is why, let's say from Iran, this poet talked about the band, the wedding band being an example of servitude, or from Zambia, Gwendolyn Coney also talks about the fact that patriarchy is trying to smother her voice, and she's not going to allow that. Again, Githai Mugo also talks about the wife of the husband, so how it's the woman who is actually doing all the work and so on, and is working tirelessly from morning to night with just 4 hours to run a sunrise. So these are in a sense ideas that are expressed by these women, and they also have, these poets also have exposure to European ideas, to trends that are there in other countries. So they have been able to kind of evolve these trends also in their own context in this manner. So when we talk about certain trends that emerge, let's say in Europe, and do spread to other countries, it's not necessary that those trends are used in the same way as they are in Europe. So I think the world literature series is particularly special in a sense because of this.
There are these two writers whom we discussed in our lectures. One was Pablo Neruda, the other was Faz. And they were also talking about man-woman relationship, and they were talking about equality. And they sang, glory of this relationship. So would that be the kind of vision that the world post-1945 is supposed to have?
Yes, but the glory can only come through equality.
Yes.
Otherwise, the word glory is a little dangerous for women, I think, because it becomes kind of equivalent to a kind of glorification which comes with ease in patriarchal structures. So I think that becomes a little problematic, but otherwise, yes, I think this would come automatically once the equation that is established is
Please comment on the love songs of Pablo Neruda.
So the love songs of Pablo Neruda particularly, I think Tonight I Write the Saddest Lines is very, very special, because there is, an understanding of love not as something that is being glorified or taken to a kind of mythical level, but it's in the moment, it's in the here and the now. And Neruda is capturing that through poetry. And when Neruda does that, is doing complete justice at the same time to the woman in a sense as the other partner.
Has Neruda united all the lovers of the world?
I think Neruda is quite witty in that context, and you know, would not look at love as a. I think humanity would be more of a viable category. Love can be, you know, a term that in patriarchal societies can be extremely exploitative as far as the women are concerned. So I think, you know, friendship, humanity, these are certainly more viable terms. And when we confront this question about what is the kind of equation, in a sense, that should be there between men and women, I think it should be one of equality, one of friendship. And that is extremely significant. So
that's why Neruda would stop writing that kind of book, you know, which contains love songs only, and he will bring in politics, he will bring in economic exploitation,
yes,
he will bring in violence and all those things. So he also would have seen, you know, that love as a category may not satisfy.
And which is why, even in Tonight I Write the Saddest Lines, in a sense, that it's not, it's that moment, as I said. It's not as if Neruda takes it to a kind of mythical level of, you know, some kind of everlasting thing. Doesn't do that at all. So I think capturing that in the moment and reflecting on that moment, and maybe that moment helps a person evolve in a certain way. But as a category, I think, you know, it would be extremely problematic, and Neruda, rightfully so, I think, does not glorify that category at all. So which is you know, something that when we look at the world literature series and the writers we cover, they concentrate more on humanity. I think the women particularly are very, very sharp. So they, you know, identify, as I said, the structures that they find to be very, very oppressive around them. And so, for instance, we have, when we look at a poem like this, and of course it can easily, it's not only about you know, prisoners and so on. So Saburo Kuroda, we did come across Kuroda's work, and who'd written Prisoners of an Era, and talks about freedom of speech and freedom of action. And so when we talk about these ideas are also to be applied, in a sense, not only to this whole idea of nation building that Saburo Kuroda is actually talking about, but also to the idea of women and the kind of country of which they are citizens. I think this idea of women as citizens is extremely important, who enjoy rights like all the other men do. So this is something, this is a concern that we can see in you know, most writers. So
the third thing that you talked about in the beginning, when you stated a few general things, was use of myths and legends. And you know, myths and legends belong to the past. They also survive in the present, and they have their roots somewhere else, and they are more imaginative than real in the sense in which you understand the words. So will myths and legends that are being used by the writers today, will they be of some significance later, or will they go against what we call science, what we call rationality, what we call different kinds of values? How the world literature has already exploited the myths and legends of the past, and which direction they are taking now?
I think when we talk about myths and legends, a very, very important idea that's taken up. For instance, when we talk about Australian poetry, Australian writing, or we talk about you know, writing, let's say, from Japan. So this idea of the myth is very significant. But at the same time, I think the myth needs to be understood through a kind of tradition, in the sense, how is that myth been passed on from, let's say, you know, one generation to the other, one particular context to the other. And a reworking of the myth in the present context would be very interesting. But I think a distortion of myths is something that needs to be always avoided, and a distortion of myths needs to be kind of read into.
In a strengthening of a myth.
Yes.
It has to be explained.
The myth has to be explained. So which is why I said that, you know, the strength of the myths lies as it is passed on from one generation to the other. So how is it, how has the myth changed in a sense? So how has it transformed in a sense? Has anything been added to it, and is the myth functioning differently? I think these are very, very important questions. And here, because you've also worked extensively on this area. So when myths are passed not only from one generation to the other, would you say that when myths are passed on, let's say from one country to another, or within a country, one region to another, so they would change?
So you have a myth, of gods at some point of time. That myth can be used by Bertolt Brecht.
Bertolt Brecht.
He can bring, those gods in front of you, and they start playing a role.
Yes.
But those gods are different than the ones, that existed earlier. So, which means that myth has to be reworked according to the requirements of the present humanity. And a lot of power can be taken from that myth to enlighten the areas around oneself. So this is what world literature has done. Taken myths, back from the past, and then now putting them forward in a manner that myths themselves did not do earlier.
Yes, and so myths are also, they should also be looked at generally, myths that are passed on and so on. They perform a kind of role in society, they perform a kind of function. And so they need to be read, they need to be interpreted, they need to be understood. And the reworking is important because they came from a certain context, they changed over the years, and now how does one respond to these myths? So for instance, certain myths that were, let's say, part of nation building. So once that idea, that sense of a nation has been acquired, so to develop it further, how does that myth function? Or for that matter, in the context of women, how does one derive strength and energy from a myth and use that, let's say, in the modern context?
You actually gave an example earlier in one of the lectures, I remember, from Japan. Yes. That Japan was totally in the grip of the visions of the past, and then it modernized itself. And that modernization was a kind of serious engagement with the myth.
Yes.
So that myth became modern.
Yes.
Is that the case?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And which is why I said that, whether we talk about Australia, for instance, or we talk about Japan. So where Japan earlier, they would, it was more of, to use the layman's words, a kind of samurai tradition that one would talk about, but a kind of modernity started entering Japanese literature, especially after the fall of the regime and so on. So the question that was raised was that what is it that literature should now do? What is the kind of role that literature should perform? So a kind of modernity in terms of the myth was also initiated, and it also started. So that becomes very, very important, I think, as a point of entry for us. So be it of the form of the tanka or the haiku, how do these ideas change? The aesthetic as well as myth as well as the idea, that undergoes a kind of modernization in the context of Japan. So for instance, when we look at a lot of the poets from Japan, they were also greatly influenced by writers abroad, by writers from Europe. And yet at the same time, they had certain traditions and aesthetic trends that belonged specifically to Japan. So how they were actually able to combine these two. So for instance, if we were to just take an example, so 17th century, we have the whole the group haiku tradition, in a sense, where writers sit together and work on it, and how then it belongs to the individual. So something like, what Shigeji Suboi writes, watching scarce flowers, the day grows dark. Around the flowers, air becomes more and more cold. Not even a moth appears now. So a kind of, a certain mood that is being expressed here. I think the Japanese poets particularly, with this, a combination of the haiku with trends from abroad, such as Dadaism and Surrealism, they really, really speaking, are able to bring forth and rework their own myths.
From your standpoint, how would you conclude, how would you, generalize on a few points regarding world literature on the basis of the lectures that you gave? And what significance does it hold for us?
I think through
just wind up and
world literature series,
yes.
I think a few key points that we need to keep in mind. The first being that when we use the term world literature, it does not mean a kind of amorphous collection of writing that contributes to the term world literature, but it means specific writing that is to be looked at from the perspective of world literature. So, which takes us to the whole discussion about borders. And so it is not amorphous, but it is, and while it belongs to world literature, at the same time, writers, poets, dramatists are able to kind of assert themselves in a very specific manner that belongs, in a sense, to their own context and country. Some key features that emerge, when we look at world literature from this perspective, then the first is that of the whole process of nation building. As I said, acquiring freedom and then cultivating and rebuilding the nation, in a sense, developing those ideas that had been specifically contributed to in gaining freedom at that point. And then from the point of view of doing away with inequalities, and these inequalities are varied. For instance, inequalities at the level of different groups of people in the society, or inequality at the level of gender. So these ideas have to be confronted. And when we look at certain trends in the 20th century, so we realize that they are all in their own ways specific to their own context and country. Writers are confronting these ideas, be it through drama, be it through poetry, so or fiction for that matter. So these are some important trends, and the idea of the myth, using folklore, using legend, all these ideas are reworked in the modern context in the 20th century, specifically a very marked shift in writing that emerges post 1945.
So viewers, Dr. Payal Nagpal has taken certain questions during the discussion that she herself raised in the beginning of her statement, and this is a summing up that should go a long way, telling us that these are the issues that writers have to face now, the critics have to face, the students like us have to face, and that world literature is going to turn into a very tangible reality quite soon. That's the hope that is there working behind the lecture series that we organized. And this is the first part of the summing up. There will be more discussions, 2 more discussions on this aspect. And I think we might carry forward from these important points that Dr. Payal Nagpal made today. Things, where answers emerge from a deep and serious consideration of the issues that we face today. So with this lecture, we come to the end of the first part of the summing up, and please wait for the second and third parts that follow during this week. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Payal Nagpal.
Thank you, Professor Prakash.